Hi, thanks for joining me for today's session, Precisely Reducing the Vulnerabilities That Matter. I hope you're enjoying Cybersecurity Summit today, this Finance and Risk edition. I'll be your speaker, Alex Babar. I'm the VP of Solutions at Brinka. And today we're going to talk about why vulnerability management is so critical in terms of financial consequences and risk mitigation strategies. So historically speaking, vulnerability management has been pretty simple, conceptually anyway. You found something, you fixed something. But that old way of doing vulnerability management just doesn't work anymore now that as an industry, we've gotten very good at the finding part of that equation, not necessarily as good on the fixing part, given the volume. What I mean by that is over the past 5-10 years in cybersecurity, there's a host of improved detection capabilities across different assets, asset types, you name it. And the scale of vulnerabilities during that time that vulnerability management teams needed to worry about changed from thousands to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands to millions to tens of millions of vulnerabilities, especially if you're in the large enterprise side of the world. And it's not like all these vulnerabilities and security findings are coming from one data source. They're coming from a variety of different data sources, from a variety of different key security programs in your organization. I've got my vulnerability assessment tool detecting server vulnerabilities. I've got my application security testing tool detecting vulnerabilities or security issues in the code itself. I've got container scanners. I've got issues with my kind of cloud configurations. So I get a bunch of different tools throughout my attack surface that I'm using to ultimately find millions of vulnerabilities. And that's breaking the old way of doing vulnerability management, is creating a set of problems for everyone. It's not a human scale problem anymore. These backlogs are flat out impossible. And vulnerability management teams can't effectively prioritize the risks that actually matter the way things are currently done. To double down on the fragmentation, it's not like anyone can go to one place and understand or navigate all these different exposures from that single place, because it's spread across a bunch of different tools that don't really speak to each other or even speak the same language as the other tool. And while that's maybe more on kind of the finding side of the equation, on the fixing side, that's also gotten a lot more complex. During the pandemic with remote work, the transient workforce over the last few years, and just the complexities of remediation ownership tied to the specific issues and remediation steps required, it's gotten really hard to navigate. Said a different way, I can identify the vulnerability on a particular asset all day long. Who do I actually need to route that to, given certain contexts that I know about the finding and the asset? It's a difficult problem at scale. Lastly, it's not like business owners and remediation teams, whether there's your IT side of the world, your development side of the world, your DevOps side of the world, are naturally motivated to prioritize security findings. It's a constant battle to justify why this critical security finding needs to be prioritized over X or Y product functionality. Why you need to turn down a server, patch it, update it to resolve an issue. So these teams, if anything, are also a little bit more strapped for bandwidth than they have been historically, and are being more and more critical and asking more and more questions to security teams, of those vulnerability management teams. Why do we need to do this? Why do we need to do this now? And while the problem's tough, this is a finance and risk event. There's a new challenge that has come up in 2023. There's increased scrutiny and personal liability now for security teams, security leaders, as part of recent SEC announcements and what they're now asking publicly traded companies to do, requiring them, really. The good news, Wall Street, your board, your financial counterparts, your CEOs, they've never cared more about cybersecurity than in 2023. because the SEC's recent regulation is requiring security teams to report on material breaches within 4 days of those incidents happening. Now, we don't have time today to go do a deep dive on this topic, but we can do a broad overview so everyone's on the same page. So in addition to all the problems I talked about a second ago, as a security team, I now need to be able to identify what is material to the business. That adds another layer of complexity of tying these vulnerabilities to the actual business applications and business goals of those applications. So you can say things like vulnerability X, which is critical severity, ties to our flagship revenue generating product and could bring it down. It's another added layer of complexity to navigate, to be able to answer that question on materiality to the business. There's some subjectiveness as far as materiality goes in the write-up. It's up to the organization themselves to determine what is material. But it's become more and more important to be able to keep those records to protect yourself from liability. And what feels clear to me and to us here at Brinka is the importance and growing importance of proactive security programs. Essentially, as part of all this process, you must be able to prove that your cybersecurity processes are actually integrated into your risk management processes and systems. I think risk management in this sense, in the bigger way, the supply chain could be disrupted. That's a risk. Cybersecurity itself needs to integrate more clearly into those existing processes. And unfortunately, in addition to the regulation, the SEC is now taking some new unprecedented legal actions in the form of prosecuting CISOs themselves. So most recently we see this with the SolarWinds example, where the SEC is claiming that the CISO of SolarWinds essentially knew more than they let on, and is trying to hold them personally liable. With that change between the requirement to file the report within 4 days for investors and shareholder protection, to potentially introduce a personal liability for security leaders, the optimistic side of me hopes that now this is the nudge that CISOs needed to be able to justify what everyone's been saying, that CISO needs a seat at that table. The role of the CISO needs to be elevated in the organization as a whole. But why act now? So aside from the SEC, aside from those other problems, there's some pretty basic issues with the current state. So vulnerability management teams that don't have the ability to accurately assess the appropriate category for the vulnerabilities they detect, i.e. taking on face value that the scanner says it's a critical vulnerability without enriching it with more context of the business to determine that materiality, runs the risk of using up their existing resources, which are pretty finite these days, on remediating things that ultimately don't really move the needle in terms of reducing the impact to the business, the negative impact to the business. And the problem with that is once that inaccuracy is detected via hopefully a internal red teaming exercise and not an external attack and breach, but once it's revealed, and as the research shows, that medium and high severity vulnerabilities are often the ones being exploited at the enterprise level in place of your, quote, critical severity CVSS finding. And it's because context really matters here. So you still need all those resources that you sunk already into remediating stuff that didn't matter too much, didn't move the needle, but you're still exposed. So the sooner that organizations start acting on ensuring accurate prioritization and categorization of severity levels, the better. The problem just grows every day you wait. In addition to that, because of the way security has kind of been built up through detection capabilities, these detection tools typically don't have a great sense of the context of the business. So without that overlay of kind of the business context and the security finding itself, determining how critical the asset, it's not really feasible to manually go in and assess, of the security controls that I have in my organization, where do I have redundancies that might not be needed so I can save some budget and reallocate that elsewhere? Or, on the other side of that, what am I paying for is I'm not using it? I set it up, paid for it, never turn it on. You'd be surprised how often these situations arise. We don't have to get into all of these, but the research is showing that the ability in time for enterprises to respond is slower than the capabilities of attackers to attack. So the ratio currently isn't in our favor. The improvements that we can make on speeding up response times ultimately would lead to, a decreased likelihood of successful attack. The last thing I'll mention here is just, with increased visibility from the board level comes an increased necessity to create reports. When all of these tools and data sources are kind of strewn across the enterprise, it becomes quite a material load in terms of resource and people power to assemble this report, and especially assemble this report in a way that a non-security person can understand, while retaining the ability to communicate this in a way that remediation teams can act on it. So I want to introduce you to a new approach to vulnerability management. It's close to our hearts here at Brinka, and it's really about managing exposures pre-attack. So it's a more proactive stance on vulnerability management, as opposed to a more reactive stance on kind of threat and incident response. And these things are related. It's not one or the other. These things work together. You do want to have a reactive plan in place, and you do want to be proactive. So if we take a page out of the Security Operations Center playbook, we've got indicators of compromise. They're coming in. We're unifying those indicators in the form of events and logs into maybe a SIM, using a SOAR to respond quickly to that. We don't really have the same sort of technology, or at least we haven't historically, on the vulnerability management side of the world. Where conceptually you want to unify your telemetry from a variety of different data sources across your attack surface. Pull in not events and logs, but actual security findings, remediation steps, that sort of stuff. And these really indicate indicators of, or really indicate exposures in your organization. So not necessarily threats yet. And this list is going to be long. You can't remediate everything. So being able to add context and prioritization mechanisms so you could proactively work through the backlog based on business impact. And the catch here is that a real risk operations center would span across the entire cyber risk lifecycle. So stop looking at this in kind of a more narrow sense of the view. There's solutions out there that have done this. There's approaches out here that have done this. Let me unify my inventory. Let me prioritize my risk. But what's really neat is the ability to stitch the whole process together. I have unified my inventory. I have the ability to prioritize my risk so that I could automate remediation appropriately and then communicate that risk outwardly. And then, pending the conversations of that communication, I know where to focus. And this is a life cycle that goes round and around and around we go. It's a pretty big initiative. And so my point here with you all today is awareness of the concept, kind of broadly speaking, how it works, and awareness that this is where the world's leading vulnerability management programs are aiming to get to, or are starting along today, just depending on maturity. And what this means is ultimately if we go back to the problems we're seeing, these backlogs are impossible, visibility is fragmented, complexity in ownership, and all that. Add together the importance of reporting with all these SEC findings and documenting those steps along the way. It's a pretty big undertaking based on the current state of how far we've gone in our kind of obsession for detecting vulnerabilities to now put that all in one place. So common starting points we see is we do see a variety of kind of software categories emerge and initiatives emerge in the industry. Maybe focus on like one piece of that pie. Don't boil the ocean. Let's just take in all our infrastructure security findings. Let's take in all our application security findings. You know what? Let's just take one stage of the cyber risk lifecycle, one data source, and improve that. I'm going to do better prioritization on my Qualys findings, for example. But ultimately, and here's the big catch, this isn't the end point. This is the starting point. And ultimately, the end goal is to put it all together in one view, in one risk operations center, so that you can prioritize, remediate, and report on all these disparate security findings with risk context from one place, one platform. And take that clear data and communicate business risk as opposed to just vulnerabilities to the business to motivate them to act, and do this across your key security programs. Now, just a quick shout out to Brinka. This idea is near and dear to our hearts. We're the only platform, purpose built to run your risk operations center. There's a variety of data capabilities, data moving capabilities, if you will, that you'd need to pull in all this data together to contextualize it, to build what we call your cyber risk graph, so that you can prioritize and remediate and communicate on top of that single data set and orchestrate things along the way. We won't talk about that today, but just so you know, if this sounds interesting to you, definitely reach out to us. But that's really all I have for you today. So let's recap. We talked about the importance of being able to add precision, to find those needles in the haystack that really are going to impact the business negatively for a variety of reasons, including the recent actions of the SEC. And I hope this was informative to you. If you'd like to follow up with Brinka, visit our website. The QR code will send you just to our homepage, so you could research some more on your own. Feel free to follow me on LinkedIn, connect with me. Love to chat with security teams and leaders about this topic, kind of learn how you all are thinking about it. And then last quick shout out on the Brinka side. So, leading vulnerability management, application security, cloud security, infrastructure security teams, and their CISOs trust Brinka to help them solve problems like these. With that, thank you so much. That's all the time we have today. Hopefully you enjoy the rest of your conference. Thanks. Bye.